Good afternoon, everyone. Today, we have with us Professor Rosa Abraham for the talk Women in India's Workforce, Sticky Floors, Glass Ceilings, and Leaky Pipelines. Professor Abraham is an economist in issues relating to India's labor market. She has been involved in the State of Working India reports and in two primary surveys, India Working Survey and COVID-19 Livelihood Survey, conducted by the Center for Sustainable Employment. Before joining Azim Premji University, she worked as a researcher at Ashoka Trust for Research in Ecology and Environment. I extend a warm welcome to her to commence the talk.
Okay. Thank you very much. It's really exciting to be here. I'm usually very, very nervous when I speak to non-economists. So anyway, we'll get started. So today's talk, I want to just talk about a compilation of my own research as well as research by others, broadly on the topic of women in the workforce. And through the talk, I'll kind of introduce you to some, major questions that have been asked, and also reflect on how economics specifically looks at this idea of women in the workforce and generally the idea of gender in economics, how it's been considered. And at some point, I also bring in my own personal reflections as well. Okay, to get started, does any of you recognize this image? Have you seen this before? Anyone? Sorry? So one thing that we're told when we have these teacher training pedagogy sessions at APU, one big lesson that we always told as faculty is get comfortable with the silence. So if I'm going to ask a question and then nobody responds, it's okay, just keep silent. Somebody will be forced to respond at some point. Any guesses? Anyone from Kerala? Do you recognize this?
I'm not sure about it, but I think this was an activity in a school where a child was asked to draw about his mother or something, and I think this is what it was.
Yes, exactly. So this was basically something that a boy in fifth standard drew, observing his mother over the course of the day. And he drew all of these different things that his mother was doing in the day. And eventually, this was picked up by the state government and is actually the cover of the Kerala Budget 2020. So, and as you can see, this mother is involved in a whole bunch of things. I mean, fetching water, cooking, preparing the items for the meal, and so on, right? So this is all work that this woman does, and typically most women do. And as you know, as all of you are fairly aware, at any given time, I mean, most women on an average are doing a lot of these things. But if you look at employment statistics for India, this is the workforce participation rate in India. And the two big lines on top, the dark blue and the dark red, are for men. And what is on the y-axis, which is your workforce participation rate, is essentially a measure of the total working age women or working age population, how many are employed. And as you can see, about 80%, 70% of men are in employment. But when you look at women, especially in more recent years or even before that, in 2016, 2017, women's employment rate was 20%, which is, out of 10 women, only two of them were actually in employment, right? So you have this idea that women are working, and then when you come to these kind of statistics, it gives the idea that most women are not employed in a sense. And you probably catch on that I'm using these two different terms, and we can come to why I'm using that, and I think it's fairly obvious. Right, so part of this, in the course of this talk, I want to kind of take you through what is going on behind this low number, as well as the decline in women's workforce participation is also a story, and we can maybe talk about it later. But for most of this talk, I do want to kind of focus on just the fact that the level itself is very low. And so in this framework, why is it that women's employment is so low? And I broadly divide this into kind of two broad things. One is that, the way, and this is specifically from an economics context, which is that the way work and employment is conceptualized is one reason why this is so low. But then there's also an issue of operationalization, which is how do you go about getting these numbers? How do you go about collecting this data around employment? Even that adds to why women's employment rate that we record is so low. Okay? So I'm going to go through the first, which is the issue of conceptualization. Basically, that's the broad thing is what is being asked. So when you talk about employment and when you try and interview women or anybody and ask them if they're employed, what really constitutes employment and how is that defined in economics is what I mean by the issue of conceptualization of employment. And the issues of operationalization, I broadly divide into how questions are being asked and who it is being asked to. Okay, so just to take a step back, all of that number that you saw, which is the workforce participation rate, is a number which is collected through official labor force surveys. Right? So the government conducts these surveys where they interview a selected random sample of households and ask them about every member in the household, what is their activity status. They could be employed, they could maybe not be employed, and they'd also collect information on the type of employment and so on. Now, the ways in which both how employment is defined, but also how this data is collected, has an implication really on what that final number is. And I'm going to take you through some of those mechanisms of what that, how it affects this. Okay, so coming to the first question, which is conceptualization, right? There's a very common joke in economics that if a man marries his cook, GDP will fall. Can you think through why this is happening? And it really gets to the heart of what I, yeah.
Am I audible?
Yeah, I can hear you.
So if a man marries his cook, then I think we'll conventionally see the chain set up as the cook is no longer being paid for the meals that she's preparing. So while earlier she was having an income, now whatever she's doing it as in the capacity of being a wife. So she's not receiving any payment for her work. So hence the GDP.
Exactly. So the idea of employment really, you can trace it back to the idea of national output, your GDP as well, which is to say that if something is contributing to GDP, however that is defined, which is basically the production of goods and services which are exchanged in the economy. So if a particular activity contributes to GDP, then it's counted as employment, right? So the moment the cook who was previously getting paid becomes the man's wife, her labor, which continues to be labor, the nature of her labor has not changed, but now because she's not doing it as sort of paid work, she's not being employed, it doesn't get counted. And so in that sense, that's why GDP would fall. So this is actually an image that comes from the Wages for Housework campaign, which was something that came about from a lot of feminist activists, which was critiquing this idea of how women's work is grossly undervalued and also invisibilized. Because at the end of it, so you have the people, the swaths of people going into factories or going for work, but behind that is this huge labor of women, either in cooking, care, cleaning, all of that, right? So whatever happens in terms of profit making and in terms of GDP is actually being at the bedrock of that really is domestic labor. And so the Wages for Housework campaign would say that it should be recognized and it should be valued in a sense, and it should be counted in GDP. And as even now, there's this very, it's almost a polarizing topic. You have feminists who believe that women's work and the work that they do within the confines of their home should be counted, valued, and added into GDP. But then you have another group of people who say that no, we should value it, but maybe not add it as GDP. And we can talk about what makes sense to you or what you're comfortable with, because but this debate still exists. But I will say that in more recent years, what we have, at least in economics, in the measurement of employment, there is a fairly good conceptual clarity. um, I wouldn't say that it's the conceptual clarity that is good in a sense that, all the boxes have been ticked, but the boundaries are not blurry anymore. Okay, so now what is being done is that employment is very clearly distinguished from work. Okay, so in the news, so there's a international conference for labor statisticians who come together and kind of define these broad statistics and what are the parameters that we want to measure. So in the more recent grouping or gathering of this group, what was done was they introduced this framework called forms of work, and employment is essentially a form of work. Okay, so not all work is necessarily employment. And so what is employment then? Employment is essentially any work which is for pay or profit. So either you get a wage or you get a salary, or you make profit from that labor. So suppose I work for Azim Premji University, I get a salary, I'm employed. My mother runs a cake making business, and she's a single person, uh, you know, business. She just makes cake, sells it, she gets profits. So she's also employed in a sense, right? But when somebody is, helping, doing domestic work, and there's no sort of exchange of their labor, they're not getting paid for that, that won't constitute employment. So any employment or any work which involves the own use production of goods and services, or even volunteer work where there's no transaction happening, would not constitute employment. So now this line is more or less clear, and I mean internationally it's accepted, and so there is a clear demarcation in what kinds of work would constitute employment, and then what would go into GDP, what would go into your WPR, your workforce participation rate that we saw in the beginning. Right? And so this we can make this statement that most women work, but not all of them are employed, right? And which is what we would also see from that image that we saw earlier. So in a sense, the conceptual clarity is there. Of course, there are still debates in that area, but the boundaries are fairly well defined. Now, when I come to issues of operationalization, what I'm talking about, like I said, is who is being asked and what is being asked, right? So typically in a labor force survey, what is done? You go to the household and there's a head of the household who's usually there, or some senior member of the household, and most labor surveys usually speak to them and they report on behalf of everybody in the household. Okay, so they would talk about their wife, their children, their daughter-in-laws, son-in-laws, all of them. This one person reports. And in terms of what is being asked, what do we typically do? And I think this is the case in most countries. This is not just in India. You would go and there's a question being asked, what did you do primarily? What was your major activity? And there's a reference period. The internationally accepted reference period is in the last week, okay? And if you did any paid activity for at least an hour in the last week, you are defined as employed, okay? But this reference period does change by country. Even in India, for example, we have a weekly question. We also ask about the last 6 months. So what was your major activity? For the majority of the year, what were you doing? So we have these different measures, but it's just a single question being asked. So what did you do either last week or for the majority of the year? So typically that's being asked, and this also has implications, right? So, and I'll talk about how this comes through. Now, to bring this, to kind of introduce you to some of these insights, I'm going to rely on this India Working Survey, which was a survey that we did in 2 states in India, Karnataka and Rajasthan. And the mandate of the survey was, one, also to understand how these labor statistics work and how if we change some things like who and how does it affect measurement. But we also wanted to look at a broader question of how social identities, which is gender, caste, religion, how does this affect what you do, the kind of occupations you do, and so on. And this was a survey launched, which went on the field in March 2020. Then COVID came in, and so we had to kind of prematurely terminate it. So March 13th was when we had to like shut down the survey. But even with that, we had about 6,000 individuals that we managed to speak to in the 2 states. And so for this, and I'm just going to draw from some parts of our survey instrument, what the India Working Survey did was, in every household that we sampled or that we interviewed, we had a male enumerator and a female enumerator going and speaking. And what they would do is, first you would get the household roster. So list down all the people who live in the household, which is the roster. And from that roster, we would randomly select one adult male and one adult female. Okay? And those were our respondents for the survey. What we also did was we made sure that the male enumerator would speak to the male respondent, and the female enumerator would speak to the female respondent. Now, if this randomly selected male and female happened to be a husband-wife pair, then we did something slightly differently for them. So to every person, to every respondent, we would ask them detailed questions. So instead of asking one question, like what was your major activity, we would say, did you do wage work in the last week? So the reference period we used was the last week, for at least an hour in the last week. Did you help in the family farm or business, or did you operate or work in the family farm or business in the last week? So we called out different kinds of activities rather than just saying, what did you do? That was one thing that we did. The second thing that we did was, if the respondent pair was a spousal pair, what we did was we asked the wife, okay, did you do wage work? Did you do self-employment? Did you help in the farm or business? But then we also asked her, did your husband do wage work? Did your husband do help in the family farm or business? So exactly the same questions, but we are asking her to report on her husband. Okay, and we did exactly the same thing for the husband as well. So husband reports about himself, but he also reports about his wife. Okay, and you can see why we wouldn't ask a man to talk about, say, if the other person was a daughter-in-law. It was just awkward to be asking those questions, especially in some of these rural settings. So we made sure that we were only asking about spouses' activities. Okay, so you can think about what this gives us, right? So one, we get information on responses when you're asking detailed questions. But two, we're also getting employment as reported by the husband about himself. But you also get employment as reported by the husband about his wife. Okay, so for every person, we would have their own reported employment rate, but would also have, for every sample, for every woman, we would have self-reported employment, but we would have this proxy reported employment, which is the employment as reported by the spouse. So what do we find? If you look at the first 2 columns, that is for the men, what was the employment rate? So 76.1. So if men are talking about men and you're asking only about themselves, we get 76.1% are employed. And when the women talk about their husbands, which is the proxy for men, about 77%. So it's more or less similar, right, when women report on husbands. Now you come to, for the women, when women are asked and they are reporting their employment status, about 60% are saying that they are employed. But the moment their husbands are asked about their wives' employment status, that's your proxy, you get about 54%. That's about 6% less, right? So clearly what is happening here is that in this sample, in this spousal pair, there's a clear underreporting of women's employment by men. Okay, and you can see that it's not just an informational thing, because if it was purely informational, you would also see an underreporting by women of men's activities. But it's clearly happening only for women that their activities are being underreported. We also have some more on this. We try to find out what are the kinds of activities that are underreported. Is it certain kinds of women and certain kinds of men who are underreporting? And I'm happy to talk about that in the discussion. But this in itself is quite stark. So what it would mean is that if you're getting, say, employment rate of 20% for women, and typically if you assume that most surveys are speaking to men, you're essentially underreporting women's employment rate. And of course, I can't kind of use this number and bump it up because this is just for rural areas in Karnataka and Rajasthan. But essentially, we are saying that some of these employment estimates, or most of the employment estimates that you're getting, are likely to be a lower bound because they are being proxy reported and women's work tends to be underreported. Oh, sorry, UR is unemployment rate. That is okay. I mean, it's still, yeah, that's fine. Yeah, that's okay. Yeah. Good question. That's a good question. So I think at the core of this is the assumption that what individuals are saying about themselves is a true status. And I agree that that in itself is a problem. But the only way to verify this would be that if we were following the women over the last week and verifying this, we could do that. But yeah, I agree. But that is an assumption that we are making, that true status is what the self reports. Yes, yeah. So the question is very clear in terms of, did you do work for wages? And then we also give, if there's some kind of doubt, if they seem a bit unsure of what they're saying, we also give a set of examples. And that's streamlined so that we're not leaving it to enumerator discretion. So they are all being consistent with what they're saying. The other thing that came out was we also asked them to talk about the number of hours they did, right? So the unconditional is basically you account for the fact that, you know, if somebody is reported as not in employment, you put the hours as 0, right? So with the unconditional employment, again, clearly there's an underreporting because there's a bunch of women who are reported as not in employment. So obviously the hours would also be underreported. But the conditional hours, which is that you're restricting it only in cases where women's work, you know, they are reporting the women as being employed. In that case, the hours are on, you know, it's more or less similar. There's not much difference, which is to say that if husbands or wives are recognizing that the other person is in employment, they're able to estimate how much time they are in employment so that they are not underreporting or misreporting. So conditional on accepting that the other person is employment, time spent in employment, they're is fairly well reported. Okay. Now this is the second part, which is the question of how are questions asked. So besides this main survey that I talked about, where we had these, you know, 4 or 5 detailed questions on different activities, we had 2 experiments, sort of experimental samples running on the side. And this is only for Karnataka. So one arm of the experiment, which is a different sample, is where we asked a single weekly question. We didn't say, did you do this, did you do this, did you do this? What did you do for the last week? So a single weekly question. And this one was a single daily question. We said, okay, we're going to ask, what did you do on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday? But it's still, we're not detailing activities, we're just breaking down the reference period. Because one way that these errors creep in or underestimation creep in is, well, maybe they didn't work. Maybe when you ask about a week in general, they are not able to recall. So ask about each day, maybe that might help recall, right? So you can broadly compare between the main survey and the single weekly, the tweak that's happening is the detail of the question. And you can see that the moment you reduce the detail of question and you just ask one question, it gets underreported. And remember here, there's no self-proxy, okay? So this is this is self-reported estimates, okay? And it's a different sample, but essentially what it's saying is that if you go to a woman and say, okay, did you work? What was your major activity? Women are just likely to just identify themselves as homemakers or, you know, we were just helping. But then the moment you call out, okay, did you help in the family farm? Did you do this? Then they are, oh yeah, I did this, right? And so that's where also what's happening is, as a woman, your primary identity is not as a paid worker, especially when sometimes these payments are also ambiguous, right? And so the moment you ask one question, they're not going to recognize that. And when you call out, you're seeing this sort of an increase in employment status. Similarly, with a single daily, you will see an increase, but this is actually not a statistically significant increase. But it is still there is some increase. That if you introduce more detail in the reference period, also seems to help aid the recollection of employment activities. Right. So these are your two ways in which the ways you ask questions and who you ask to can clearly affect employment measurement. This is this is a favorite quote of mine, and this is by this anthropologist called Rainer Reiter. And anthropologists have always been doing things far ahead of what economists are doing. But they said this, I mean, a great deal of information on women exists, but it frequently comes from questions asked of men about their wives, daughters, and sisters, rather than from the women themselves. What women do is perceived as household work, and what they talk about is called gossip, while men's work is viewed as the economic base of society, and their information is seen as important social communication, right? And this kind of, I feel, really speaks directly to what we are also saying, that you're not talking to women directly, and you're not also allowing them, in a sense, to recognize that their work is forming an economic base of society, because you just kind of allow them to adhere to standard identities. Yeah? Okay. So, so this is one big, less discussed in the literature, that we are not measuring women's employment correctly. One huge chunk of work is invisibilized. But then there's also a bunch of other reasons why women's employment rate is so low. And I broadly divided this into demand side constraints and supply side. So when I say demand side constraints, it's basically an issue of that there's just not enough work, and the kind of jobs that women would want to work in is not available. Unfortunately, there's not much empirical evidence on this, besides establishing that in India, for example, agriculture contracted. So as the economy grew, agriculture contracted, and manufacturing increased to some extent, and services sector also increased hugely. But the big chunk of employment that we've had, in the last few decades has come from construction. Now, when agriculture contracts, what happens is that a whole bunch of women are pushed out, or they choose to exit from agriculture. And the kind of jobs that are appropriate for them or that they want to work in are no longer available. And so because that demand is not there, women are either forced to exit or they willingly exit. That's the demand side. There's not much evidence, but we can talk about that. I mean, whatever there is, there's some things to show about how some of the exit is not entirely voluntary. Some of it is actually a voluntary exit that women have, and I'm happy to discuss that. But the other supply side is to say that there's all of these norms, and it's basically women's attributes and their family attributes that determine whether they want to work or why they're not getting work. And some things that are discussed here is major life events, right? The choice of education, what stream they choose, the life events of marriage, motherhood, and how all of these can have a say or can have an effect in determining whether women choose to work or whether they work, as well as the kind of employment that they end up being in. So I want to kind of focus on the supply side, and through this I want to focus on major life events that women experience and kind of their relationship with women's employment. Right? You all familiar with this? This is shadi.com, and sorry? Sorry? Yeah, there's a VIP, there's a whole bunch of stuff. Coincidentally, when I was working after my master's, and I think I was of that age where I should have been married, and all of my family were very worried about me. Somebody, I still don't know who it is, created a shadi.com profile for me, and I would get I would get people mailing, and they had everything. They had all of my information, my CTC, everything, and I would get the stuff from, I think it was Bharat Matrimony. But anyway, but this thing, this idea that you need to get married and there's a right time to get married is clearly there. And I want to talk here about a really interesting paper by this person called Diva Dhar. And this also, I wanted to talk about this because I think it's a very nice way to use this particular technique. So this is a method in economics, also used in sociology, called correspondence studies. I don't know if you're familiar with audit studies or correspondence studies. Those are different names for it. Okay. One of the most famous correspondence studies is the study called Is Jamila as employable as a Henry or a Kevin, which is kind of what it tries to do is it tries to see, tries to capture biases in society. Okay, now what this, and I'll talk about it in the context of this particular study by Dhiva. What they did was they created a bunch of fake profiles of women in shadi.com and bharatmatrimony.com. And then what they did was they made sure that these profiles were identical. I mean, to anybody else, it wouldn't look identical, but education, age, all of your other descriptions, photos, I think were not there. So all of these things were very similar. But then they tweaked few things so that you can actually talk about how that particular tweak is affecting responses from potential suitors. So what did they tweak? So they put up all of these profiles, and for a bunch of women, they said, the woman in her sort of description said, I don't want to work after marriage, and I will, I do. And then there's another bunch of profiles where they said, I want to work after marriage, and then the kind of preferred occupation. So they also said, they had a bunch of CVs where the women wanted to be teacher, wanted to be nurse, your gender and conforming roles. So that was a bunch of CVs. Another bunch of CVs where women in those said that they want to basically have jobs which didn't conform with these norms, right? So they maybe wanted to be a pilot or a mechanical engineer and so on. And then what did they do? They put this up there and they tried over time and then observed this over time to see how many matches were these CVs getting, right? And so then because everything else is identical, what this is kind of getting at is, well, it's actually this one thing that is either attracting suitors or keeping them away. So what did they find? Employed, yeah, so they had another set of CVs where women were currently employed, okay? So employed women were 15% less likely to receive interest from male suitors relative to women who were not working, okay? So obviously for a potential suitor, seeing a woman who's employed was a clear dampener. They didn't really want to follow up on that. And then of the women who were employed, you also see this preference for certain kinds of employment, right? So if women were employed in masculine occupations, they were 3% less likely to get interest from suitors in feminine occupations. Okay, so, and this is actually from a different paper, which is, sorry, I forgot to put the citation, but basically this paper is very recent, also finding that every year that a woman delays her entry into marriage actually costs her in terms of groom quality. It costs her in terms of the education of the groom, I know it's very depressing. It costs her in terms of education of the groom, the kind of family that she gets to marry into. Yeah.
How does the visibility of these profiles work? Like, if I've got two profiles, how do I know that they are being seen by the same number of people?
Yeah, so there's nothing else that is different between the profiles. So it's not like there are certain profiles that are given VIP access and so on. They're all equally likely to be seen. So I think there are ways to pay and improve. They didn't do any of that. So any view is as random for any profile. So it was broadly comparable. right? Yeah, so, I mean, and what is this? Yeah.
Since you mentioned the word groom quality, like you're categorizing women like according to their suitability or an age to marriage, you're also categorizing men by their quality, right?
Yeah, in this paper, yes. Yeah.
So there are also certain norms for them to be a
Absolutely, absolutely. But and in fact, it's a more recent thing now. A lot of in places in, especially in the north, you have men not finding adequate. I mean, they don't have matches because they don't meet groom quality. Okay, and that is, but that is more recent, and that's a phenomenon, basically a result that education levels for women have caught up and slowly starting to exceed that of boys, right? But the general trend remains that in the case, in the marriage market, as it's called, the, the buyer power, in a sense, is always with the men. I think it's fairly safe to say this. Sorry, I'm using very economics language, but it's quite crude. But that is the case, right? So for women, this, when it comes to employment, especially for young girls who've left college, it is a huge upward battle that they have to fight because there are these compromises that they might have to make as a result of the choice to be employed, right? And to take a step back, even the choice of education and continuing in education, because of the fact that it ends up delaying marriage, can also have similar consequences, that how long do they stay educated. And so, I mean, and this is the thing, that for parents, this becomes a case where parents are investing in their, you'll find that education rates for men and women are almost similar. Parents are willing to invest as much in their girls for education, but the difference is that parents are investing in their girls for education, basically for the marriage market, whereas parents invest in their boys for education for their labor market outcomes. So it's the end game is very different. So even if you find that women are getting access to college, they are getting access to go abroad and study, if you look at evidence, and even, I mean, also anecdotal evidence, that the end game really is that, oh, if she has a degree from certain places, she'll get a better match, right? I have been told that don't study so much because you're not going to get a suitable match. I've been told multiple times, as in the course of my my MA, and I mean, I had 2 or 3 MAs. I kind of delayed my entry into PhD because I was very unsure what I wanted to do. So I kept, doing 1 or 2 MAs, and then I would get this pushback that don't study so much. It's not, which is, and I think it's a very real conversation that happens in a sense. So some of this is, of course, in a very high-income urban context, but I think the latter one really applies to almost all contexts in India. Yeah. So that's marriage. The other thing that comes into play is, and when it comes to employment, is this idea of motherhood penalty. I assume all of you've heard this at some point. Have you heard this concept before, this idea of motherhood penalty? But it's fairly intuitive? Not as a word. Yeah, but how would you? And what is the idea that it is?
that women, once they enter motherhood, they might leave the workforce. So a lot of workplaces prefer men over women candidates because they might leave later and leave the work. I mean, they
Yeah.
have to pay for their maternity leaves also. I mean,
Exactly. Yeah. So, and that's the view from the firm side, that they view women as lesser candidates or costly candidates because of all these costs associated. But also from a woman's perspective, there's a penalty associated with motherhood. As this is the standard understanding, that what happens that women could, suppose they've managed to break the odds and they've entered the labor market, they are in employment. Now, the moment they have a child, after the childbirth, there's a cost that is associated, and usually the cost is they are withdrawing from employment. So that's one kind of penalty that they face, that they can't work post childbirth. But even if they continue to work or they return to work, the other kind of penalty that they face is that they actually have lower earnings and they never really catch up with men's earnings. So this idea of motherhood penalty is actually very well established in the context of high-income countries. Okay, so this is from this paper by Clevin et al. In fact, they have a really nice map called the Childbirth Penalty Atlas, and you can find the strength of this penalty across different countries in the world. But this is basically for Sweden, Denmark, Austria, Germany. And what is this showing? So the vertical line is the event of childbirth. Okay, so 0 is when childbirth occurred. And a simple interpretation is, okay, so every year before that and every year after that on the x-axis. What the y-axis is capturing is relative to the time just before childbirth, what is the change in employment rate? Okay, and you can see the top two lines for men, nothing happens. Like childbirth happens, they work before and they work just as much. An equal share of men continue to work. But you see for women, which is the bottom two lines, the top one is for Denmark and then the next one is Sweden. There's this huge fall, right? So what does that mean? That post-childbirth, women's employment rate falls by about 20 to 30%. Sorry, yeah, 20% for Denmark and about 40% or 60% for Sweden, right? So 60% of women really exit post-childbirth. And I'm sorry, this is not employment, this is earnings. Sorry, this is the fall in earnings. So 60%, there's a 60% fall in earnings post-childbirth. And I think the most stark part is that it's not a one-time cost, it persists. So it's that they never really catch up, that post-childbirth, they never end up catching up with what men are making, right? So previously, men and women are earning fairly similar amounts, but post-childbirth, it falls and it falls drastically and it never really comes back up. And so this is the standard idea and how motherhood penalty is typically been conceived and kind of investigated in economics. And so if you were to think about how you would go about collecting this, ideally what you want is information on a cohort of women and men over a long period of time. You want to see these people over a long period of time, and you want to see when the event of childbirth happened, and then you want to see, post-childbirth what happened, right? And in India and most developing countries, you don't have that kind of information, okay? So the other way then one can think of is, well, why don't we just compare earnings for a mother and earnings for a non-mother, and then we can say what's the childbirth penalty. Do you think that's okay to do that? You think that gives us an idea of childbirth penalty? So I am a 30-year-old or a 40-year-old mother, and I look at somebody else who's a 40-year-old without a child, and I look at, okay, this is the earnings, and that's the cost of childbirth. Any issues with doing this? You think this is fine? Why not? Exactly, right? Intrinsically, the woman who selects into childbirth or the woman who chooses to become a mother may be very different from the woman who doesn't become a mother. So you're really comparing apples with oranges, and ideally, if you want to investigate a childbirth penalty, you need to be tracking groups of women over time and then observe the event and then do a pre and post kind of analysis, right? And because we don't have that data, this similar kind of evidence is not really established in India. But what we did using the India Working Survey was that we used this technique called a life history calendar, where we basically, again, retrospectively asked women from when they were 15 years old, when did childbirth happen, and what was their employment in the years before and in the years after, up until then, okay? So that gives us like a historical information of women's employment trajectories, only employment, not earnings. And what we found was actually, in a sense, that there's no change in employment. Okay, so, and this is IWS was a purely rural sample. We found that post childbirth, actually, women's employment didn't fall; it continued to increase. Okay, and most of the increase was in informal work. And when I say informal work, basically work where there's no regular salaried payment. You don't have a contract, you don't have benefits. You are either a casual wage worker, you work in somebody's farm, or you are self-employed. That's what I mean by informal paid work. So most of the increase, so there was no penalty, and most of the increase was in informal paid work. So I think when we first saw this, we were surprised. We were like, oh no, there's no penalty, what's going on here? But if you think about it, and if you think about what is going on, can you guess what this means when you say that rural women don't have a childbirth penalty or a motherhood penalty?
Facility, or they don't really have the time to devote to the children, I guess. They're not able to have the basic amenities of motherhood. Probably it's like their workload is
Yeah.
doubled.
Workload is?
Like they have to take care of their child and also work wherever they're working, but still they're managing to do both.
Yeah. I think both of you got it. I mean, one way to look at it is that they're managing to do both things, and that they don't have sort of the support or the facilities.
They cannot afford to be unemployed.
Exactly. So for most women, especially in the rural context, the luxury of taking time off after childbirth, withdrawing from the labor market doesn't exist, right? That's one. The second is what you spoke about, which is that they do these things, sort of simultaneously, and that's what the informal labor market allows women to do, right? You have these kind of arrangements where you can either work in the business, or you can do this kind of home-based work, right? And that kind of informal labor market, in a sense, gives women a temporal flexibility. They can choose when to do that work. It also gives them a spatial flexibility, that they can choose where to work from. They don't need to go to an office or a factory, right? But overarching this is the idea that it is a luxury to withdraw from employment. So women have to continue in employment, and that, because there's an informal labor market, it kind of facilitates that continuation in employment. And this is actually something that see in other low-income country contexts, where, actually there's only one study that does something, in terms of collecting this kind of data, which is in Chile, which also has low-income households, where they're finding that post-motherhood, there's no employment penalty, but there's a formal work penalty. So women withdraw from salaried employment and go into informal work. So ends up being fairly precarious, usually underpaid, there's no job security, but they continue to work, right? Which then, you need to then also step back and reflect on this idea of a penalty and the idea of employment in that sense, right? So the absence of a penalty, in a sense, doesn't mean that it's a favorable outcome. But employment is a necessity and not a choice for most of these women. And the implicit understanding, so in the larger, this debate, or larger understanding, this idea of motherhood help penalty, which has really been framed in a high income global north context. The idea is that employment is good. Oh, so when women are not working, it's bad. We must bring women into the workforce. But then in this context, you need it's that the absence of the penalty is really not indicative of a favorable outcome. And in fact, there's also studies which show that, for women in these low-income households post-childbirth, what happens? They return to work earlier. It could be it could be their casual or informal work. Their children are also having much earlier weaning, so their breastfeeding time reduces for children. Maternal health is also much poorer, and so there's other studies in nutritional and health context which shows that this absence of a penalty really comes with other kinds of penalty, which is borne by the mother and by the child, right? And so then it's just also stepping back and thinking about, what do we mean by employment? And if you read some of the larger debates in India, it's all about, oh, we need to bring women into the workforce. There's only 20% workforce participation rate. How do we increase this? It's also a question of quality of employment, right? So it's just not, and in fact, if you remember in the graph, a lot of the increase that you see in employment in India in the last few years has been informal employment. So women's share in salaried work has not changed, or it's actually fallen in the last few years, which also then talks about, okay, behind this idea of increasing employment, we also need to talk about the kind of employment that we should be increasing for women. And this kind of, I mean, for us, this was also a time to kind of contest this larger understanding of a motherhood penalty based on these results. Okay. How much time do I have? 12 minutes, okay. Yeah, I should be done. Now, if women do enter, and now I'm going to talk mostly from a salaried urban context because those results are rural. When women do enter and when they do interview for jobs, these are some of the questions they are asked. And I know this because I was asked all of these questions when after my PhD, when I was interviewing for teaching jobs, and this is not my current employer. I interviewed in a couple of other places. I was asked these questions. How many kids do you have? Do you plan to have more children? What job does your husband do? Does his job involve transfer? Do you know how to wear a sari? And then I was told to practice wearing a sari for 1 week before joining that college. So yeah, I mean, and these, I mean, and I'm quite ashamed at this point to say that when they asked me those questions, I participated in answering them because there is a power hierarchy, and I wish that now I wish I had just told them, this is wrong, you can't ask me these questions. But of course, when you're sitting in an interview room and there are all of these things at stake, you just sit quietly and answer this, right? So this is a and this is very explicit discrimination. But of course, there are far more subtler ways in which these things operate. But this is very real. It's not that all of your DEI and all of these other initiatives means that these don't exist. This still exists. Okay, and that's the hard reality of it. Of course, I think greater representation of women in these kind of committees, in these panels, although the first two questions were asked by a woman in the panel. But I think it's, you need to think through who gets to ask, who is in this panel, and also accountability around who gets hauled up for asking questions like this, right? So once they do choose to work and choose to, withdraw, take the children are there, they've kind of battled the family norms and they enter, then in the workplace, there's this also happening, right? So there's multiple challenges, and this is, I think most of you might have seen this picture of what happens when women do enter the workforce. And I want to just go and bring it a little closer to home to look at what happens to women in academia. So this is based on a paper by Bansal, Brinda Vishwanathan, and Meenakshi Rajiv. And what they did was they actually data scraped information on agricultural universities in India. And they looked at the scholar profiles to get at this information. So the blue bar is the share of female assistant professors, okay? And this is over time. And then you have the orange, which is associate, and then the mustard one, which is professor. And you can see, right, that's your leaky pipeline right there. So there's about 40% of women coming in as assistant professors, but as you go up the career trajectory, women in associate professorships and in professorships are very, very low, okay? And the other thing that they also found was that if a woman does reach a professorship status, she actually has far more citations, and citations is sort of one index that they use to measure extent of work and kind of their reach of their work. So a woman professor will have far more citations than a male professor, which is to say that, okay, if you want to sort of break that glass ceiling, you need to be far more qualified than your male counterpart. So it's much easier for a man to go up these ranks, obviously. But as a woman in a professorship position, you'll actually be far ahead of your male counterparts in terms of certain statistics, right? And this only captures one side of it. Of course, there's different kinds of ways in which in academia and other kinds of areas that this kind of glass ceilings as well as sticky floors kind of play out. And yeah, so this is just again from that paper. So only 13% of leadership positions in universities are held by women. Finally, I want to just look at the earnings, right? And I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but essentially the numbers, it's saying that if you're in salaried work, you make about 3/4 of what men make. And if you're in casual work, 60%, and if you're in self-employment, about not even half. You make less than half of what men make. Now, you can ask me, well, that's probably because women are less educated. That's probably because women, to choose the kind of jobs that are less paying. That's why they are earning less, right? So in the State of Working India, which is a publication that we bring out every 2 years at the Center for Sustainable Employment, what we did is that we kind of looked at, now there's a method where there's a decomposition method where you can control for these individual attributes. Let's take out the educational differences. Let's take out industry differences. Let's take out regional differences. After controlling for all of that, and then now you're like really comparing like with like, how much of these differences can be explained, because of these attributes. So what you're finding is that 90% of the earnings gap is unexplained. It's not explained by individual characteristics. It's not explained by industry characteristics. It's a little too much of a leap for me to say that all of this earnings, this 90% is actually discrimination, because we don't capture, the data doesn't allow us to capture all of these individual differences. So some of that will still be there, but a large chunk of this is still capturing discrimination, either at the employer side or at the worker side. Yeah.
Why is there a difference from salaried work to casual work and self-employed?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, so what is salaried work is sort of, it's formal work, okay? And there's different ways that that's possibly happening. In this very raw wage gap, what you're finding is that salaried work, women tend to be more educated, okay? And with salaried work, there are probably legal structures in place to kind of make sure that differences don't exist. And because women in salaried work tend to be more educated or just as educated as men, then that gap kind of closes, right? And in fact, if you actually look at over the deciles of salaried work, so if you look at the top decile and the bottom decile, in the top decile, actually they're very close. Okay, they earn almost as much as men. It's at the bottom where the gap really persists. So let's think of it this way. Again, if I go back to the academia example, if you are able to make it to professorship, you are equaling your male counterpart. But if you're remaining in the lower end, and in this case, the lower end wouldn't be assistant, it may be housekeeping staff in that university, you are very far away from your male counterpart, right? So your occupational progression matters, and their salaried work allows you to kind of close that gap. Now with casual wage work, what is casual wage work? Think of your construction worker, think of your agricultural worker, right? And with construction work, it's very clearly defined. If a man comes with his wife, the payment is always, the cash goes to the man, okay? And how does it go? He's paid as a 1.5. So that woman is recognized as a 0.5 worker. So if he is getting 100 rupees, if he brings his wife along, then it's a payment of 150. So it's almost like an institutionalized thing of like, we only pay half. And one of this is because it is drudgerous work, but I wouldn't say that's because women can't do the drudgerous work. Of course, there are limits, but there is a very, again, institutionalization of that difference. And there's no possibility for sort of progression there, and if you look at anywhere across the distribution, you'll find that in casual work, it remains at around 60%. Self-employment, what is self-employment? The kinds of work that women would do as self-employed, your tailors. Sorry, I know somebody had a question, but I'll come to you in a bit. Sorry. So self-employment would be tailors, your beauty parlor workers, tuition teachers, home-based work, or you're running a shop, right? And a self-employed man it typically is not that, but they're probably running some business. It could be a little shop or some kind of trading activity. What happens with self-employment is that as a woman, you are not only interacting in that labor market, you are going to have to interact with an input market. You will have to work with contractors. You will have to work with clients. Clients meaning it could be your the houses that you go to as a tailor. I think all of that different markets kind of work on top of each other and then kind of makes this difference even more. So it adds up, it accumulates and makes this difference much higher. Also there is the occupational difference that comes into play, right? Teachers are going to be paid much less than a businessman, and women will never go to that, a businessman category. Yeah, sorry.
So, can you hear me?
Sorry?
Can you hear me?
Just about, yeah.
So, in case of casual wage work, the men will be stronger and would be able to do lot more work than the women. Also, the planning and stuff, maybe
The?
also the planning of how the work will be done, that will be mostly carried out by the man. So, I think it's fair that it is calculated as 1.5.
Okay. No, see, on the manual work and physical capacity, yes, to some extent that is valid, right? I would push back on the planning. Okay. I think this is. I think this is basically this idea that I'm not sure why do you think that men are.
I'm not saying that the woman is not capable of doing the planning.
Exactly, yeah.
I'm just saying the situation would be
Exactly.
would be planning also.
And why is it that men are planning? Because in a sense, there's also that norm at play that women are not allowed to move up into that position of planning, right? So you won't see a supervisor, a casual work supervisor being a woman, right? If they could do it, like you're saying, they would be as good planners, but there's a ceiling there. They're not even allowed to go into that position, even though they may be just as capable as a man of taking up that planning role. And that's, the simple answer to that is patriarchy. There's these, one patriarchy is really one answer. But I would also say that there's just not enough, in the Indian context, is also the idea there's just not enough jobs, right? And the moment jobs are in short supply, women are going to get rationed out, right? Because if you see the example of in the US and other European countries during the war, when men had to go out, they were getting drafted and they had to fight. Women went in and took up factory work. They took up the planning of the factory work. Then they were able to kind of move up and in a sense challenge a lot of norms, right? But in the Indian context, there is also the larger issue that we don't have enough jobs. And I'll come to that in my concluding slide. But I do think that that is one part. But there is also the structural thing that women are just not allowed to move beyond a point because they, yeah.
A good example to this can be that more than physical ability, the social restrictions play a part. That suppose a woman is running a shop, she has to close earlier than her male counterpart because of the social norms that tell her that she needs to be back home early.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
more than physical work here, like the social restrictions are playing a
Exactly. And so that's why you will have a lot of, in fact, more recently, because a lot of states have started that free bus transport schemes, right? Now, there's evidence to show for Delhi when they introduced that pink slip, I think, which was the free bus tickets in Delhi. So women's bus travel was essentially free. There is evidence to show that employment went up, right? So the one is there's a mobility constraint simply that they can't go very far. Then there's also the fact that there's an expense that they may not have the luxury to bear. And when those constraints loosen, they are actually able to work, right? So on the one hand, there's this norm at play, but then there's also these very structural, very infrastructural issues in a sense that we don't have safe spaces, we don't have safe transportation, we don't have jobs nearby, and you don't have safe workspaces. Okay. So, as part of IWS, we also did a whole bunch of qualitative surveys where we spoke to women. And there was a woman who was a metro worker, and she was one of the ticketing staff. And it was a full-time salaried job. It allowed her to sit, which by the way is a huge thing for women's employment, that they allowed to sit during their period of employment. Because a lot of retail workers, they're expected to stand throughout their shift. But she quit 3 months into the job because she was getting harassed by her male colleague, right? And this is not an isolated incident. We spoke to, I think it was a small service, we spoke to about 20 women, and I think about 12 of them reported instances of being harassed by colleagues or customers, right? So even that kind of, I mean, it's partly norm, but also just a structural issue of not having a safe workspace does keep women away from all of these kinds of employment. But at the end of the day, for many women, that is choice of staying out is also not there. They end up having to continue in certain kinds of work as well. Yeah, I mean, so this kind of just to bring this all up, that you have a high educational attainment, you have declining fertility rates also, and typically in most northern countries, high income countries, this is associated with women returning into the workforce, or women increasing in the workforce. We don't see this, and part of this is that there's just not enough jobs. That is the other side of the story, the demand side that I spoke about, that we just don't have enough jobs. Okay? I want to just come back and kind of reflect on some of these things, like the larger things. And I think these are two really, really nice books that I would highly recommend for, I assume that a lot of you are going to be working with data, you're going to be either collecting data, looking at data. And I think these are two books that look at data from a feminist perspective, and also very reflective. The first one is Data Feminism, and this one is Invisible Women. I think the Data Feminism book is open access. But I think with the first project, I mean, the first kind of things that we went through, which is who is asked, what is being asked. I think when, as a researcher, you're looking at this data, it's important to step back. Whatever data you're working with, where is this coming from? What was the power hierarchy at play there, right? Did some people not get counted at all? Who gets counted and who's not getting counted? Those are things that should be fundamental to any data that you are approaching, on what are we systematically excluding and what are the power hierarchies that were in play. For IWS, it was clearly the male-female hierarchy. It was clearly, I mean, I think any researcher, when you go into the field, there is a power hierarchy, right? It is a very extractive position that you are in. And in many cases, things like consent and so on are very important when collecting that data. And then the larger question of, in the context of employment, what does employment mean? Do we just advocate an increase in employment rate for the sake of increasing employment rate without really talking about the penalty of employment that happens for most women, for a lot of women in India? And then I want to just end with this, because I started with something from Kerala. This is a image from the textbooks in Kerala. I think, I don't know which standard, but they're trying to make these sort of gender neutral images. But just to talk about, there's a larger crisis of jobs in the economy, and there's a need to build up the supportive infrastructure. It could be mobility infrastructure, it could be care infrastructure. And the final thing really, which I think we need to talk about more, is really about bringing men into the conversation. Because a lot of these discussions and a lot of these reflections tend to be in spaces with women, whereas men, especially men in leadership positions, kind of bypass a lot of these discussions. And I think they need to be actively recruited into this, both in terms of just, in employment, but also men at home, taking up an equal burden of care and domestic work. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to stop here and open up for discussion or questions.
Thank you so much for enlightening us on this topic. Are there any questions?
I had some questions about the graph that showed motherhood penalty. I was just wondering how many people in the survey actually started working post motherhood, like when they started working. So the change in earnings could be something like, if you don't go back to work for 5 years after motherhood, there will, I think, be a difference in the amount you earn. So how much of it can be attributed to that difference? And do they work the same number of hours that they used to prior to motherhood? And do they do the same work, or do they um, like do a different type of work which is usually paid lesser?
Yeah. So this is actually coming from this particular study in, but what in these country contexts, there's actually not an employment penalty, especially in Sweden and Denmark, where they have a very good sort of social welfare infrastructure. There's very supportive care infrastructure for women who go back into work. Employment doesn't actually fall, and most of the fall is in earnings. And so, and you're right that the point at which they re-enter could also have a say in, the extent of the dip. That's true. I'm not sure if they kind of talk about that, but yeah, it's definitely something that can come into play. So it's the relative fall vis-a-vis the period just before childbirth. So the zero time point relative to that point, because you can see at zero on this axis, the earnings is zero. So it's relative to that how much it falls. So relative to just before childbirth, the fall in employment. So, and in terms of, yeah, so now in this study, they don't look at the sort of change in occupation and change in earnings, but this is actually very well documented. So I don't know if you're familiar with the last Nobel winner, which was Claudia Golden. So she has done similar kind of work in the US context largely. And one thing that she finds is, especially in the case of like the new kinds of jobs that are coming, where you have this, flexible work. And actually, flexible work in a sense sounds very attractive, right? But what she talks about is this work where, for lawyers, say, now you can go from 4 hours at work to 5 hours, and you can go from 5 hours to 6 hours, right? Now, every increment in hour for a normal job, let's say, would be met with an equivalent increment in earnings. So the fourth to fifth hour gives you 100 rupees more, and the fifth to sixth hour gives you another 100 rupees more. And that's a linear pay structure, right? Now, what she finds is that in the US context, a lot of jobs, particularly the high paying jobs, this increment is no longer linear. So when you go from the fourth to fifth hour, you may get 100 rupees. But when you go from the fifth to sixth hour, your increment in earnings is actually 200. So every hour actually adds a lot more, right? Now, when your pay structure is actually set up like that, and that is really what happens with a lot of sort of this legal work for it, and that's the specific occupation that she actually looks at, where it's like hours with a client, you're billed on that kind of time. Women don't have that luxury of kind of working more hours, and so men have that sort of flexibility in hours and extending their work. And so a lot of the gender gap that comes is coming because work has become really kind of flexibilized in that sense, and so a lot of the gap actually comes with women essentially working fewer hours, but on top of that, facing a higher penalty because of this non-linear returns to hours.
There are no more questions. Please join me to thank Professor Abraham.